In week three, you kind of deal with, the public manager and the chief political executive. Obviously managers are having to deal with their constituents and those that, the public, but then they're also dealing with the chief political executive. Maybe talk a little bit about even the Chase chapter there where he deals with Kennedy and the Bay of Pigs.
Well, if you're a senior manager, the most important person in your life is your elected chief executive. That can be the president, the governor, a county executive. Many counties have county executives, or a mayor. And these cats are an interesting breed, and we spent a fair amount of time talking about them. Who are they? What are their characteristics? What are they good at? What aren't they so good at? And as Chase points out, none of us who get elected as chief political executives in this country, with very rare exceptions, have ever managed anything. We don't come out of the corporate world. We don't even come out every once in a while. I mean, my friend Mike Bennett, who's now running for the Senate in Colorado, was the school superintendent. Okay, there's a guy who had managed his friend and colleague, the mayor of Denver, is now running for governor. Well, he's obviously been managing a lot at the city level. Before that, he organized his own business, a brew pub business, which was extremely successful. But that's unusual. Most of us, as Chase points out, come via the legislative route or some other route. And we're great advocates and policy people, but we've never managed the corner store. And so if you're one of that elected chief executive's managers, you find yourself dealing with somebody who may be passionate about what he or she believes in, have lots of ideas and so forth, but has never managed anything. And so we spent a fair amount of time dealing with how you deal with him or her and their staffs. Because one of the problems with a lot of folks who are elected to public office is that they bring a fair number of people who are involved in the campaign in with them. There's nothing wrong with it. I mean, the campaign itself is a pretty tough test of whether or not you're capable of being effective in the public sector, but oftentimes they're young. I don't want to sound like old granddad here, I was young once. They can be pretty arrogant. This power they have kind of goes to their head. And because they've never managed anything, they're trying to tell you, the senior manager, what to do. Yeah. So Chase spends a lot of time dealing with that and how you maneuver around. Now, if you have a chief political executive that, like me, who didn't like a lot of staff around, I didn't have policy assistants in my office. President Obama feels otherwise. That's fine, different strokes for different folks. I wanted my cabinet secretaries to be my chief close-in policy people, as well as my managers. And they could walk in the door anytime they wanted to, and there was nobody out there as a gatekeeper. When you have elected chief executives that surround themselves with a lot of policy assistants, usually young ones, that can become difficult. And you can tell as you read Chase just how frustrated he is and was, and how he had to kind of develop a whole set of approaches to deal with all these young geniuses surrounding Mayor Lindsay, who he had to deal with. So my preference as an elected chief executive is not to have a lot of that clutter. Pick cabinet secretaries carefully and well. Make sure that they have both policy making and management and political skills, and then make them your first team, and don't have a lot of people between you and them. But other elected chief executives feel otherwise. Now, the Bay of Pigs thing was a classic, because this was a case where a young president, very bright, very smart, politically skillful, but somebody who had never managed before, walks into a situation where he's inheriting, in effect, a secret and illegal plan to invade Cuba and overthrow Castro. And it's a classic. You walk in, the thing is already underway. Not a lot of people know about it at this point, but you've been pretty tough on Castro during the campaign. I mean, you're not going to let Nixon out anti-communist you. And then you get elected, and you find that there's this full-blown plan, which turns out to be a disaster, as he himself said. And we got 1,400 Cuban exiles down in Guatemala training secretly. 74 or 75 Cuban exile pilots in Nicaragua. Both countries run, needless to say, by friendly dictators, which is why we're there. And here's a president who's been elected on a commitment to turn around an economy which is in a recession. And now he's got this thing. And what I ask my students to do is to imagine that they are McGeorge Bundy, dean at Harvard, who's going to be the new national security advisor. What would they advise President Kennedy to do after they have this meeting a week, 10 days after he's elected, where for the first time he and Bundy are briefed on this Cuban invasion plan? I mean, what are the kinds of things that you ought to be, what are the kinds of questions you ought to be raising for the president? What are the things that he should be looking at? And the sense you get is that Bundy never did that. Now, who knows? So the president kind of inch by inch found himself getting pulled into this more and more and more. And we all know what happened. And there are lessons in the Bay of Pigs case for a lot of things that have happened since, needless to say, including Iraq and Afghanistan. This whole question of how civilian elected officials, I can use that term, even those like Kennedy who were genuine war heroes and was deeply involved in combat in the Pacific, how you deal with a military which comes to you and says, we got the solution here. This is the way to, the solution, and so on. And we now have a young president, not much older than Kennedy, who had to face exactly the same situation when his generals came to him and said, we got a military solution to Afghanistan. Well, time will tell. But at least President Obama, in dealing with Afghanistan, engaged in a long and relatively public process. That was not what happened in President Kennedy's case, and he regretted it. And when, 2 years later, it came time for him to deal with the Cuban Missile Crisis, it was a very different president who, quite frankly, went up against his generals and effectively said, I'm not going to accept your advice. And it turned out he was right and they were wrong.